Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we are diving into what might be, the ultimate battleground of human ideas, God versus science.
Yeah, it's a huge one.
It really is. So over the next few minutes, we are going to unpack the historical suppression of scientific truth. We'll dig into the hidden and honestly highly dangerous history of atheism and explore why this immense tension between divine plans and empirical facts isn't just some ancient philosophical debate.
Right, it's still happening.
Exactly. It's an ongoing collision that actively dictates what happens to our physical bodies in hospitals and, what is allowed to be written on the whiteboards in our classrooms today.
Yeah, and our sources today provide this massive chronological examination of this exact conflict. We're looking at the intricate nuances of how religious institutions shaped early science, the intense debates around the existence of God, and how those arguments manifest in the modern world.
Which is fascinating to see mapped out.
It is. But before we peel back the layers of this history, I do want to establish the ground rules for you listening. The texts we are analyzing deal with highly sensitive topics regarding religious dogma, the nature of God, and the societal mechanics of atheism.
Right, very sensitive stuff.
Exactly. So our goal today is purely to impartially convey the ideas, the historical data, and the philosophical arguments exactly as they exist in the source material, without taking any political or religious sides. We are simply examining the evidence.
Just laying it all out on the table. And hey, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button because you are definitely going to want to stick around for how we break this down.
Absolutely.
So let's start by dismantling the biggest myth surrounding this topic. When you usually hear about religion and science, the popular narrative is incredibly simple, right? It's the idea that religion simply hindered science.
Just a total roadblock.
Right, full stop. A total absolute war between the two. But looking at the historical data in our sources, that narrative is actually quite flawed, isn't it?
It's a massive oversimplification, yeah. I mean, we often crave these clear heroes and clear villains in our history, but the text really forces us to look at the deeply dual role that religious institutions played.
Like a double-edged sword, kind of.
Exactly. You cannot look at the timeline of human advancement without recognizing that during certain periods, churches and mosques were the primary and sometimes, honestly, the only institutions actively preserving and transmitting human knowledge.
Wow, the only ones.
Yeah, they were the ones building the vast libraries, physically copying the manuscripts, funding the scholars, and just keeping the intellectual lights on while secular empires were literally collapsing around them.
Okay, let's unpack this, because it reminds me of an analogy. It's kind of like having an incredibly wealthy but fiercely strict parent.
Oh, okay, I like that.
Right. So on one hand, they are completely funding your life. They pay your university tuition, put a roof over your head, and give you access to the most elite resources in the world.
Right, so that's the preservation of knowledge part.
Exactly. Without them, you don't even get to go to school. But on the other hand, they aggressively forbid you from picking your own major.
Oh yeah, that's a great way to put it.
The moment you decide you want to study something that challenges their worldview or, goes against the family tradition, the warmth just disappears. They don't just cut off your funding, they actively suppress your ability to study it anywhere else.
Yeah, the tuition in your analogy is that massive institutional backing that early scientists completely relied on. But the approved majors, so to speak, were strictly monitored by these deep theological red lines.
So you could only study what they deemed safe.
Pretty much. And the text emphasizes that the most intellectually honest approach is to accept both of these realities simultaneously. The religious institutions preserve the very concept of academic study, but they also engineered the ideological cages that those academics were forced to work within.
And I imagine the penalty for trying to break out of that cage was fairly severe.
Oh, incredibly severe.
Which brings up the ultimate historical collision of this dynamic, I think. Because if we want to see this strict parenting mechanism in action, we really have to look at Galileo in 1633.
Oh, absolutely.
He's basically the poster child for institutional suppression, isn't he?
He is. Galileo is the paramount example in our sources because his case illustrates exactly how those theological red lines function in reality. So
Okay.
Galileo championed Nicholas Copernicus's heliocentric model of the universe.
The sun-centered one.
Right. By using his newly improved telescope, he gathered empirical visual evidence that the Earth orbited the sun and not the other way around.
I always try to put myself in the shoes of the religious authorities at that exact moment. Like, why did they care so much?
It seems like just an astronomy debate, right?
Exactly. From a purely theological standpoint, why does it matter to God if the earth goes around the sun or the sun goes around the earth?
Well, it matters because of the massive theological architecture they had built over centuries. The church had completely intertwined its interpretation of the Bible with the ancient Greek physics of Aristotle.
Oh, right. Aristotle.
And Aristotle's model placed the Earth at the absolute stationary center of the universe.
Hmm.
Theologically, this was perfect for them. It meant humanity was the literal focal point of God's creation. Every star, every planet, everything revolved around us.
So if Galileo is right, and the Earth is just another rock spinning through this vast indifferent void, it physically displaces humanity from the center of the divine plan.
Exactly. It threatened the entire hierarchy of their theological authority.
Wow. So they weren't just arguing about the math, they were arguing about humanity's core relevance to God.
Yeah, the stakes were existential for the church.
And because the institution held all the power, they didn't even have to win the mathematical debate, did they? The Inquisition just put him on trial, forced him to publicly deny what he had seen with his own eyes, and locked him under house arrest for the rest of his life.
Which is a chilling display of institutional power over facts.
It really is. But what I find really compelling in the sources is the contrast. Because while this rigid stagnation was choking Europe, the text points us to a completely different dynamic unfolding in the medieval Islamic world.
Yes, the Islamic Golden Age,
Right.
which actually predates Galileo by several centuries. You see a completely different relationship between faith and empiricism there.
How so?
Well, the Islamic world was making these massive foundational leaps in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. The sources highlight key figures like Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and Al-Kindi. And what is really crucial to understand is that these scholars did not see a division between their faith and their science.
Right, they weren't doing science in spite of their religion.
They were doing it because of it.
That's a huge distinction.
It is. Take Ibn Sina, for example. He compiled the Canon of Medicine, which was this massive encyclopedia that actually set the standard for medicine in Europe and the Islamic world for centuries.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize it influenced Europe that heavily, too.
Oh, deeply. And he utilized intense empirical observation to understand human disease. For him, and for the rationalist tradition of that time, studying the intricate mechanics of the natural world was seen as the highest form of worship.
Like, unraveling the mysteries of biology or the stars was essentially reading the mind of God.
Exactly. The physical world was treated as a secondary sacred text.
So what broke that incredible momentum then? Because the text notes a massive shift starting around the 12th century. The rationalist tradition weakens, religious conservatism surges, and the scientific output of an entire civilization just kind of plummets.
Yeah, it's a very noticeable drop-off.
I just struggle to buy that as a pure coincidence. Are we supposed to believe that math just naturally stopped happening at the exact same time theological conservatism spiked?
Well, the sources imply it as a direct mechanism of cause and effect. Definitely not a coincidence. When a society's theological paradigm shifts from viewing exploration as worship to viewing exploration as a potential threat to orthodoxy, the entire societal infrastructure pivots.
Everything changes.
Exactly. Funding for observatories dries up. The social rewards for being a boundary-pushing physician are replaced by the social rewards for being a strict theologian.
Right, so the incentives shift completely.
Yes. Intellectual momentum stalls because the physical safety and financial security of scholars become tied to strict conformity rather than open discovery.
Man, that perfectly sets up a massive debate in our sources regarding the true nature of belief. You hear this counter-argument all the time today, right? People will say, how can you say religion suppresses science when so many of history's greatest scientists were deeply devout believers?
Right, the religious scientist defense.
Yeah. They point to Isaac Newton writing more about theology than physics. Or they point to Gregor Mendel, the father of modern genetics, who literally discovered the laws of inheritance while working as an Augustinian friar in the church's gardens.
Or George Lemaître, the guy who first proposed the Big Bang Theory, who was a Catholic priest.
Exactly. So how does the text handle that?
Well, on the surface, it seems really compelling. But the text provides two profound caveats to this argument, forcing us to heavily evaluate the historical realities of God and atheism. The first major caveat is the hidden and often coerced reality of atheism throughout history.
Oh, here's where it gets really interesting. Because looking back and counting up how many 16th century scientists believed in God, completely ignores the societal mechanics of the era.
It ignores the survival aspect.
Right. It's like looking at a totalitarian regime where refusing to wear a specific military uniform gets you executed, and then using the fact that everyone is wearing the uniform as proof that they all genuinely love the fabric.
That analogy cuts right to the core of the societal mechanism at play. Because in past centuries, stepping outside of the accepted religious framework was not some quirky philosophical choice you made on a weekend. It was quite literally a matter of survival.
Because the institution controlled everything. Everything. They controlled the universities, the publishing houses, the grocery markets, and the legal system. You could not participate in the basic functions of human society without signaling a belief in God.
You wouldn't just lose your funding. You couldn't get a marriage license. You couldn't own property safely. You would be utterly ostracized, if not just straight up burned at the stake.
Right. The stakes were life and death.
So how on earth can we look at the historical record of piety among brilliant minds and know how much of it was a genuine, deeply felt spiritual connection to the divine, and how much was simply the baseline camouflage required to survive in a society that legally outlawed atheism?
We can't know. We just can't. It is a massive historical blind spot. When the penalty for openly questioning God is the absolute destruction of your livelihood and your life, the historical record inherently skews toward universal belief.
It has to.
But even if we set that aside, even if we assume every single one of those brilliant minds possessed a profound, genuine faith, the text presents a second, deeply structural caveat, which is that an individual's personal belief does not magically rewrite the design of the institution they work within, right?
Precisely.
Like, Gregor Mendel's personal faith might have been rock solid as he worked with pea plants in his monastery, but Mendel's personal piety doesn't retroactively erase the Inquisition.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't undo the institutional periods where the church actively hunted down scientific inquiry. You can have incredibly brilliant, devout individuals working inside a system, but that doesn't change the fact that the system itself is structurally designed to throttle anything that challenges its core dogma.
That's it, exactly. Individual piety does not negate systemic suppression. And this friction we are describing is not just an abstract debate about the cosmos or some historical debate about who really believed what in the 17th century.
It's much more tangible than that.
The text emphasizes that this conflict exacts a very real physical toll. The text actually refers to this as a battle, which is an old term essentially meaning a heavy exaction or a physical or societal cost paid when scientific progress is halted by theological mandates.
Let's talk about those costs, because this is where the debate leaves the realm of philosophy and directly enters our hospitals and our bodies. The medical hurdles outlined in the sources are just staggering.
They really are.
For centuries, examining human cadavers to understand basic anatomy was either outright banned or so severely restricted that doctors were essentially operating blind.
Right, and the mechanism behind this restriction was deeply theological. It stemmed from beliefs regarding the absolute sanctity of the body and literal interpretations of the resurrection of the dead at the end of days.
Wait, really? So they literally believed that if a physician dissected your arm to figure out how a muscle worked, you would arrive in the afterlife missing that arm.
That is the exact theological roadblock. If religious dogma dictates that the physical vessel must remain perfectly intact for spiritual salvation, then anatomical science is fundamentally paralyzed.
That is wild.
Physicians were desperately trying to figure out how to fix the human machine, but the overarching religious institution made it a literal sin to open the hood.
It is chilling to think about the body count attached to that dogma. I mean, how many surgical techniques, how many life-saving medical breakthroughs were delayed by hundreds of years simply because looking at our own biology was deemed an affront to God.
The loss of human life due to that delay is incalculable. And that friction did not end in the Middle Ages either.
No, it didn't.
The text highlights that even as recently as the development of early vaccines, there was fierce resistance from certain religious circles. The theological justification back then was that disease like smallpox was either a divine punishment for societal sin or a specific test of faith engineered by God.
So by that logic, taking a vaccine to cure the disease is actively thwarting God's plans.
Exactly.
You are interfering with divine judgment, which is a terrifying logic if you are a parent watching your child get sick. And what the sources make crystal clear is that we haven't outgrown this. We are still paying these bills today.
Oh, absolutely.
We see it in the modern battles over reproductive rights, where access to medical procedures or sexual health education is heavily restricted, not by empirical medical consensus, but entirely by religion-based opposition.
And that battleground extends directly from the hospital into the education system, too. Consider the fallout from 1859 when Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species.
Oh, yeah, the big one.
The theory of evolution by natural selection fundamentally contradicted the literal interpretation of Genesis and the creation narratives.
And we are still fighting that exact same war today. The text points out that there are legal battles happening in the United States right now, literally today, over whether to teach creationism or intelligent design alongside evolution in public school science classrooms.
Which is the active attempt to force fundamentally religious concepts into empirical scientific curricula.
And this is the core realization for you listening. These aren't just academic squabbles about ancient history. When a school board decides that theological dogma holds equal weight to biological data, it dictates what a teenager learns about how their own species developed.
It shapes their entire worldview.
It dictates what counts as factual reality. There are real, tangible costs here, flesh, blood, and dogma. So, looking at all of this, the historical suppression, the medical roadblocks, the ongoing fights over the classroom whiteboard is a peaceful truth between science and religion, even philosophically possible.
Well, that remains the ultimate question in the text. Many modern thinkers attempt to resolve this tension through a popular framework known as NOMA, which stands for non-overlapping magisteria.
Oh, I've heard of this theory. It essentially argues that science and religion have totally separate, non-overlapping domains of authority, right?
Yes, exactly.
Like they are completely different tools designed for completely different jobs. Science is the tool we use to answer the factual, empirical questions. You know, what is the universe made of? How do cells divide? How does gravity work?
Right.
While religion is the tool we use to answer questions of ultimate meaning, moral values, and human purpose.
And the appeal of NOMA is pretty obvious. It promises intellectual peace. If both sides just stay in their designated lanes, there is no conflict.
It sounds great on paper.
It does. But the text offers a severe critique of this framework, arguing that in actual practice, the borders constantly overlap. NOMA fundamentally fails because religion, historically and currently, does not restrict itself only to questions of abstract meaning and morals.
Exactly. If religion truly just handled the why and science handled the how, there wouldn't be a vicious fight over dinosaur bones or the age of the earth.
No, there wouldn't.
Religion doesn't just say God loves you and you should be kind to your neighbor. It makes incredibly specific, explicit claims about physical history and cosmology.
And it has to make those claims to support its moral framework. Let's look at the mechanism behind this overlap. Many theological doctrines of salvation, such as the concept of original sin, require a literal historical Adam and Eve.
Right.
They require a specific historical event where humanity fell from grace, necessitating divine redemption. When empirical science demonstrates through genetics and evolutionary biology that the human population never consisted of just two individuals, it doesn't just challenge a historical fact.
It breaks the foundation.
Yes, it fundamentally threatens the theological mechanism of salvation itself.
So the friction is inevitable. You cannot claim the Earth is 6,000 years old as a matter of religious faith and expect it not to crash directly into geology and astrophysics.
They're going to collide.
You can't separate the why from the how when the religious why relies on a very specific, scientifically testable how. The overlap happens. This second religion steps out of the abstract moral lane and tries to dictate physical reality.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for us? Let's trace the journey we've taken through these sources today in our deep dive. We started by breaking down the myth of absolute conflict, recognizing the dual nature of historical religious institutions, how they operated as both the wealthy preservers of human knowledge and the strict, absolute oppressors of scientific truth.
A very complicated legacy.
We pulled back the curtain on the historical reality of atheism, realizing that when an institution controls your ability to survive in society, looking back and trying to count genuine believers among historical scientists is a deeply flawed exercise.
It's almost impossible to measure.
And most importantly, we saw how this philosophical tension demands a physical toll. From the historical bans on dissecting cadavers that delayed medical science for centuries, to the modern-day courtroom battles over teaching evolution to our kids.
The stakes are as high as ever.
The battleground between divine plans and empirical data is still fiercely active, and it dictates the medical care we receive and the reality we teach our children.
The historical tension is undeniable, and the mechanisms of that tension continue to shape our institutions today.
And to wrap up our analysis, I want to leave you with a final thought that builds on these sources, something to consider as we move into the future.
Okay, let's hear it.
Well, we've spent this time discussing how human institutions suppress human science to protect their view of God. But if science and religion truly exist in completely separate, non-overlapping realms, why do religious groups still fight the theory of evolution? And if that religious intervention dictates what children are taught in science class, can we really just wave it off as a personal belief anymore?